Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the finals! Alright, we've been doing it wrong. We in the West and we as the United Nations have quite simply chosen the wrong course of action when it comes to helping countries reach democracy. And that's what we are here to prove to you today on Side Proposition. What I'm going to do during this speech is I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to define the debate topic. Then I'm going to get into our first constructive point, which is freedom, and our second constructive point, which is protection. Now, before I get into any of that, let's see what we're talking about. We're going to define this house as the United Nations. And what do we mean when we say that we would be willing to impose democracy? Well, that means that in cases where it is the will of the people to depose a corrupt regime, the UN would use military intervention in order to depose the regime and in order to instate free and fair elections after the fact. This would be very similar to examples like we've seen in Egypt, Libya, or Syria, where we chose to basically do nothing and let the fight run its course. And instead, under this resolution, the UN would put meaningful and fast-acting force on the ground in order to depose the regime. Now, let's get into our first point, which is freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, quite simply, democracy means far more freedom than having every rule, every law dictated by a regime whose main interest is protecting the regime. And this has a couple of different benefits. There are two real significant ones. First, we're going to talk about social benefits and then the economic benefits. All of this is in the pillar of freedom. So, socially, we have a better quality of life. Why is that? Well, because I'm not being oppressed. And not being oppressed is fun. It means that you're now able to access the internet, you're able to access Facebook, you're able to access media and news without censorship. It means that you're able to go to visit your grandparents without passing through a checkpoint. It means that you're able to go and do your religion freely, to do all sorts of things that you wouldn't be able to do under an oppressive regime. Because the oppressive regime has to do all sorts of oppressive things in order to maintain its power. A democracy is inherently better for the people because they're going to want their own freedom. The people have a vested interest in their own quality of life over supporting the government. Whereas when you're in an oppressive, corrupt regime, their interests are in protecting their own power. And protecting your own power sometimes, or almost always, require coercive secret police, fear campaigns, all sorts of oppressive, very unfree things which make the quality of life of the people worse. Ladies and gentlemen, the social situation will be better if we remove these regimes from power. Now, some of the economic aspect of freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, the interests of countries that are controlled by a central authority, a small number of people, is to centralize their wealth, to move it into the middle and to control all the wealth. A great example of this is Burma, where the ruling junta managed to build $1 billion new capital in the middle of the jungle that nobody wanted. Meanwhile, the people starved. Because they had a lot of money, and they frankly didn't care about the rest of their people. Whereas in a democracy, well, the people care about the people, so they're going to have an interest in distributing the money. Another great example of this would be North Korea. One of the things that we found in attempting to negotiate with North Korea is that it's really hard to do sanctions on North Korea, because we do food sanctions and the government just quite simply doesn't care. The people are starving, but the government doesn't care. Whereas in a democratic institution, the people do care. So if we're giving people votes, we can expect that they're going to be much more economically distributive instead of centralizing. That taxes will be meant to help the poor, to create welfare, to support the society, instead of to support the government. Because that's what the people want, because it benefits the people. Yes?
How are we imposing democracy if people are already changing these countries?
The way we're imposing democracy is with tanks. Ladies and gentlemen, just because the will of the people is to be able to run their own affairs doesn't mean that the people in power are going to let them do that. That's why they use coercive methods, that's why they use violence, that's why we have the situation we have today in Syria, where the government's in a protracted war with its own people in order to try and maintain power. I don't think that's very relevant to POI, but we have many examples from the Arab Spring where this has actually happened. So we talked about freedom. We showed you that there are many social benefits because the people care about decreasing censorship and increasing their ability to go and do what they want. We showed the economic benefits because now the government's going to be talking about distributing the money instead of trying to centralize it, which is going to be inherently far more efficient. Now let's take a look at protection. Ladies and gentlemen, oftentimes these battles are not going to just go away. Just because the West has largely refused to intervene in Syria doesn't mean that Syria has stopped being at war. In fact, what we see is that in these situations, if the people have a true will to have freedom, they're going to fight for it. And then oftentimes this ends up creating more violence and having protracted fights like in Syria, like in Libya. And that this was actually going to have a very negative, tangible harm in the form of violence. If you take a look at, for example, Syria, under this resolution, the US military or other militaries under the auspices of the UN would show up in Syria, and as we know, the Syrian government would be gone inside a week. They can't handle airstrikes, they can't handle tanks, they can't deal with the military might of the world. When it's a few people who are fighting basically back with what they have, with improvised weapons, with basically the spirit of the people, as opposed to a military, you can't expect much. You end up with a protracted fight, with a civil war, with a battle that goes on for a very long time, and ends up with far more damage. If we see that there's going to be a fight, and that's when we're going to be intervening, then the UN should say, you know what, we know which side is right, and we ought to settle this quickly and with the least damage possible, and that's what we would do by implementing this resolution. We're actually going to be protecting the people, because when we show up on the ground, we're going to be there, and we're going to be able to end the fight. Would you agree?
No, sir, I wouldn't agree. Are you proposing that we resolve violence with more violence?
In fact, ladies and gentlemen, yes, I am. In case unless I'm mistaken, the way we ended World War II was with a lot of violence. Generally speaking, the way that we would go about doing this is, instead of leaving a nice balanced war, which, while it might be fun to watch and like really exciting and good for news, is actually very drawn out because of the imbalance, of the balance between the two forces. If we have a balanced war, then it's going to be long, it's going to be protracted. Eventually, one side will get in, but it'll take a while. If we have a very unbalanced war, where it's the whole world against one corrupt government, that's not going to take very long. And so we would say that a shorter war is preferable to a much longer war. And that's why we believe we're actually protecting the citizens by implementing this. Especially in the situation where you have an oppressive regime, because they often don't care about their citizens and are willing to use very underhanded, very unfair, and blatantly immoral tactics when they're fighting for their lives. So we see that we don't want these regimes to continue to fight, because when they're fighting, not only are they having a long war, but they're doing it in a very bad way. Because they're shelling their citizens, they're bombing their citizens, and they simply don't care. So, what have we seen today, ladies and gentlemen? We've told you that when the people want something, and the people are willing to stand up for it against a regime that's against their interests, we believe the people are more important than the government. And with that in mind, we've looked at the idea of how are we ending this? Well, we could just stay out of it, we could just let it settle itself out, and sometimes it will. But if you let it settle itself out, it's also going to end up with a long war. It's also going to end up with many lives lost, many infrastructure destroyed, and it's going to end up being very harmful. So instead, we would go in, we would use violence, and we would make sure that the people are able to make their own decisions. And that is going to be far more effective, even if the people don't make decisions that the UN likes, at least the people are making their own decisions. And the people are going to make decisions that are better for them, as opposed to a government which makes decisions that are good for the government. Ladies and gentlemen, free the people.